The Night Fairy, Chapter 3. Okay, so let's look to see what our little thumbnail illustration shows us. It is this, and it looks like the squirrel. Underneath it, it says Scuggle. And we know that she met a squirrel in the last chapter, in chapter 2. So now let's find out what happens. If a person, whether she is human or fairy, spends most of her time thinking of ways to sting, it is bound to show. I think this is true. I think that if you think of stinging things and hurting things and being angry at something that's out there that you don't even know or see, or you've thought that you hated, maybe even you use that word hate, then you start to look and feel very spiky and stingy. In the weeks that followed, Florrie practiced her stinging spells so often that she began to have rather a prickly look. Her nose and her chin grew more pointed, as did the tips of her ears. And I think with humans, they're like, mm. Spring drew closer to summer. The tulips dropped their petals and the peonies bloomed, fat mattresses of milky petals and rich smells. Florrie grew used to the sound of birds singing and the sight of them making their nest. She even grew used to the giantess, who came every day to fill a clear tube with seeds. Florrie began to hanker after the seeds herself. She knew that after summer came autumn and then winter. She was not afraid of the cold. A fairy can lie naked in the snow and warm herself with magic. But she thought it might be a good idea to fill her house with food. When winter came, there would be no green shoots and no pollen. She could not fly south like the birds. A little cache of seeds and nuts would be very useful. She decided to make a rope bridge to the oak tree. She began to gather dried cobwebs, which could be spun into long ropes and knotted into ladders. If she could travel from tree to tree without climbing down to the ground, it would save hours. She would be able to raid the seed tube every day. Making the rope bridge took time. Even when dried, the spider webs were sticky, and Florrie had no knife to cut them. She had to gnaw them with her teeth. The spinning work was hard too, until she found a spell to help her. She twisted the strings of cobwebs together and closed her eyes, thinking of the way a vine twists around a tree branch. After a moment or two, the cobwebs began to writhe like snakes in her lap, and Florrie breathed steadily, letting her magic flow from her hands to the cobwebs. And when at last she opened her eyes, the strands had twirled together, forming a rope that was stronger than steel. She had just finished a new rope when her sensing feather throbbed. I'm really glad she has this sensing feather. That means she knows when danger is coming, right? Maybe when rain comes. Didn't they tell us that? We'll have to look back in the other chapters to see. Okay. At once, she jumped up, ready to sting. The squirrel leaped down through the cherry tree, landing on the roof of Florrie's house. Florrie was not surprised to see him. He tried to pounce on her at least once a day. By now, he ought to have known that it was no good. Florrie always stung him. But he was either very hopeful or very foolish. Florrie didn't know which. Because she's not taking the time to talk to him. If she had talked to him, she would find out. The squirrel stood on the top of the wooden house, his paws dangling over his white belly, his nose twitched. He looked as if he were trying to make up his mind whether or not to pounce. I wouldn't if I were you, Florrie said to the squirrel. I'm glad that Florrie's learned to give the squirrel a warning. The squirrel leaped. Florrie spoke the words of her stinging spell almost before he moved. It hit the squirrel in midair. He twisted and shied away from her. I told you, Florrie taunted him. Ooh, taunting. That's a different thing than saying, you need to stop because every time I really am serious. Taunting is like, I stung you. I'm going to keep doing it. I told you, Florrie taunted him. The squirrel turned tail and dove down the cherry tree. He headed for the seed tube. Florrie had noticed that he was very fond of the seed tube. He hung on it for hours, gobbling seeds. But today, there was a new tube, one with a clear dome on top, at the top. So now she explains that illustration, why it's different than before. Okay. The squirrel looked puzzled and then worried. He leaped onto the dome, but it was slippery and his claws had nothing to hold on to. If he clung to the hook and hung upside down, his front paws couldn't reach the food tray. If he let go of the hook, he slid down the dome and landed on the grass floor. He burst out laughing. Ha ha ha! Florrie, you're getting spiky. You're getting spiky. She watched for an hour. The squirrel jumped onto the dome again and again, his claws scrabbling for a foothold. He stretched himself, flattening his body. He tried leaping straight up from the ground, but it was no use. There was room for the birds to fly between the dome and the seed tray, but there wasn't room enough for him. Florrie laughed heartily, but she began to wish that he would get a little bit of food. In the past week, she had learned how hard it was to fend off hunger. She didn't feel sorry for him exactly. She had never learned how to feel sorry, even for herself. But her laughter grew less shrill and her eyes looked rather thoughtful. At last the squirrel gave up. He streaked over the grass and galloped up the cherry tree. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Florrie. His beady eyes glistened. He was truly hungry now. Don't, Florrie warned him. But the squirrel paid no attention. He flung himself at her, only to give a cry of pain. How stupid you are, Florrie said. I think that word, stupid, she's using there should be different. If Florrie was thinking, she would say, how hungry you are. She didn't know how rude she was. She had never been taught manners. I've stung you twice already. I'll sting you every time you try to pounce on me. You can't eat me. I'll hurt you if you try. The squirrel sat back on his haunches. I'm not stupid, he said in a muffled voice. I'm hungry. You can be both, Florrie pointed out, which is actually true. The squirrel thought about this. He shook his head. I can never think on an empty stomach, he said, and my stomach is always empty. Florrie thought of pointing out that this meant he was always stupid, but she didn't. Oh, she held it. She kept that idea inside her head. Florrie might be learning to be kind. She kept that idea. Looking closely, she could see he was rather a young squirrel. His grizzled coat hung slack and his tail was skimpy. You could still get the seeds from the seed tube, Florrie said, only you're going about it the wrong way. It's a new seed tube. Didn't you notice? The squirrel nodded. The giantess keeps putting up new tubes, he complained, and each one is harder to get into. I don't understand it. She must want me to eat the seeds or she wouldn't hang the tube in the tree. She's a giantess, Florrie said. You can't expect her to have any sense. The squirrel cocked his head as if he had just had a new idea. You're a night fairy, he said. I can tell from your shadow. Why are you awake in the middle of the day? I'm a day fairy now, Florrie said. You're supposed to be a night fairy, said the squirrel, and your wings are all broken off. Florrie frowned. She didn't like to talk about her wings. What's your name, squirrel? She asked haughtily. The squirrel scratched. I'm hungry, he repeated. I'm not going to call you that, Florrie said. I think I'll call you Scuggle. Scug is another word for squirrel, you know. Hey, we just learned a fairy word. Scug. It's another word for squirrel, you know. Scuggle, echoed the squirrel. He tried it out. Hungry Scuggle. Listen to me, Florrie said briskly. I can help you get the seeds from the new tube, but I want some seeds for myself. A brilliant idea came into her mind. And I want to ride on your back. Scuggle stood with his paws at his side and stretched his neck forward. They have an illustration for it. There, look how tiny. Hold on a second. That adjusted. Here. Can you see how tiny she is? She's on the branch and he's looking at her. It was something he did when he was trying to think. No, I want to eat all the seeds. You can't have any. Greedy, Florrie jeered. You can't have them all, but if you do what I tell you, you'll get some. That's better than none. Scuggle's paws twitched. He had very dainty little paws. They looked like tiny gray gloves. I want the seeds. Then you have to let me ride on your back. Scuggle shifted his weight from side to side. You won't weigh much, he said, thinking the matter over, and I'll get the seeds. It's good. Florrie took a step towards him. He was so big that looking up at him made her neck ache. "You're very wide. If you take hold of the end of my tail, I can flick you onto my back," said Scuggle. "Only you have to tell me about the seeds, you know." "I will," said Florrie. "Let me up." She caught hold of the edge of the squirrel's tail and wrapped her arms and legs around it, and the tail lashed forward. In another moment, Florrie crawled up the squirrel's neck and settled down beside his right ear. "Now listen," she said into the squirrel's ear. "You can't get the seeds from the top. The dome is in the way. And you can't get it in from the bottom either. You won't fit." "What can I do?" asked Scuggle. He sounded as if he might start to cry. "You can knock the seeds out of the tube," Florrie said. "Go up the oak tree, grab a hold of the hook, you hear? Because you can hold on to that. Swing back and forth as hard as you can. The seeds will fall out of the tube and you can eat them off the ground." Scuggle's eyes glistened with greed and hope. "I love you," he said happily. Chapter 4. I know what it's going to be about. It's got the thumbnail of a hummingbird flying, and it's called The Hummingbird. So that's what it's going to be about, and we'll read that tomorrow.